Good evening and welcome once again to Life Changers Global Ministries Kingdom Life Institute. We're so glad that you took the time to join in with us and be a part of. We're very excited today. We have a subject matter that we know you will find very interesting and beneficial to you. Here at Life Changers Global Ministries, under the directorship of our pastor, Apostle Dr. Earl Newton, and our First Lady, Lady Newton, they make this time available each Monday night to us that we may come to you with different subject matter involving the kingdom as a total. Tonight, I'm very pleased and very proud to have as our speaker for tonight and next Monday night also Dr. Gamage. He is Chief of Staff at Cal State Dominguez Hills. I will let him introduce himself further from there. Let me get out of the way and hand it over to him. I'm going to take you before the throne of grace. Then you'll be in the hands of Dr. Gamage. Father, as we come before the throne of grace, we come with a glad heart. We come with a thank you, Jesus, on the inside. For we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time. We thank you for that is going to go forth and be beneficial to the kingdom of God in its entirety. Thank you for our speaker. And we thank you for each and everything. These and all other blessings we ask in thy son Jesus' name. Young man that grew up here at Whole Truth Church of God in Christ, none other than Dr. Justin Gamage.
Good afternoon, good evening, good evening. As stated, thank you for spending some time with me. My name is Dr. Justin Gamage. As Minister Gamage has stated before, I am an associate faculty member in Africana Studies at Cal State Dominguez Hills, and also I've had the pleasure of serving as Chief of Staff for the President of Cal State University Dominguez Hills. So today we'll be talking about wealth, and we'll be exploring some trends as it relates to wealth. We'll specifically be focusing on wealth amongst African American households, different trends in terms of how African American households store their wealth, the trends or the factors that influence how wealth is acquired, the barriers that's historically been placed in front of African American households, but also strategies for overcoming those barriers and strategies for African American households to accumulate wealth over time. And so, with that stated, I'll first like to thank you all for spending time. As I tell my students, one of the most valuable assets that you have is your time. Once it's spent, it's gone forever. There's nothing that you can recoup or get back. That time is gone. So I appreciate you all spending this moment of time with me. Hopefully the information that I do present is fruitful and useful. Maybe you can apply it and implement it and hopefully have positive outcomes with the information that I'll present. So with any conversation about wealth, I think we should start with defining exactly what wealth is. I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what wealth is. And sometimes people associate wealth with factors that are not necessarily wealth itself. It might be a factor that or a vehicle toward wealth, but it's not wealth in and of itself. And so we'll start by defining wealth and getting into what that actually looks like. And so we'll start there. I have a couple of things that I will try to do to engage some participation. Hopefully it works. This is an online system, and so of course technical difficulties always happen. But if you all can participate, please do so. My most effective teaching strategy for me is to engage others and engage in a dialogue or a conversation. So hopefully we can do that. Hopefully it's fruitful for everybody. So I'm going to share my screen and get my presentation underway. Okay. So is it back?
Yes.
Okay. So we'll start by defining what wealth is and coming up with a definition that defines wealth so we can clearly understand what it is. So we'll also know what it isn't, and that we won't have any misunderstandings about what is wealth and what isn't wealth. So I'm going to kind of go back and forth since the audio was going out. I'll share my screen and kind of give you all a glimpse on my definition or the definition that I'm utilizing to kind of frame this conversation. And then I'll come back in so I'll be able, so you all can hear the audio. All right. So we'll make it work with the technical difficulties that we have here. All right. So first, let's look at the definition of wealth and how it's defined. So I was able to show you all a graphic of where I'm framing wealth. And so essentially when you want to define wealth, it essentially is defined as the total extent of any given moment at any moment of time that an individual or a household accumulated assets and access to resources minus the debt that they hold at one point in time. So, for example, if you want to know what a individual is worth, again, it's what assets they own and access to resources that they have minus the debt that's held against those resources or the individual itself, right? Wealth is anything of economic value bought, sold, stocked for future disposal or investment to bring economic return. So an example of this would be ownership of stocks, ownerships of bonds, money in the bank, real estate, and business ownership. Those are examples of wealth, but wealth also can be held in other ways. Um, but essentially, wealth is what you own as it relates to value and assets minus what you owe as it relates to your own debt. So when we look at the dimensions of wealth, there's two forms of wealth. The most common form of wealth that is most commonly discussed is what's called net worth. When you look at net worth is uh, the accumulated value of all assets that you own, but it also includes the equity of those assets. And I'll talk a little bit about equity uh, a little later on. But it's the total value of all assets that you own, including equity uh, and property more specifically, as well as things can be converted into cash, right? So it's the accumulated amount of value placed on all assets controlled by an individual or household, right? There's one more dimension of wealth that's not commonly discussed, but I would say it's the most important. It's net financial assets. So your net financial assets are those assets that you own that can be converted into liquid cash uh, with ease, which essentially means that in most cases you don't have to borrow from it in order to uh, get the value out of that particular asset. So those are the two main forms of wealth that I'll be using kind of to frame our discussion. Um, so let's somewhat talk about what wealth isn't. I think in most cases, in my research and in my discussion, in my courses, and conversations with people in general, people generally associate wealth with an individual's income. Now, income is a factor that influences your ability to accumulate wealth, but it's not wealth in and of itself. What you make, it can be transformed into wealth, but income in and of itself is not wealth, right? In most cases, what your income is the value or assets that you use to sustain your day-to-day activities. So that's what you use to pay your mortgage, pay your rent, right? To feed yourself, clothe yourself, and provide any resources that you need in order to survive on a day-to-day basis, right? So I'll give you an example. If I make $100 within a given month, but it takes me $99 in order to sustain my lifestyle, then there's a very small percentage of that income that can be stored or transformed into wealth, right? So if I spend everything that I make, of course, it's not wealth. Wealth is not something that you use to sustain your expenses or anything like that. So the thing that I want you to focus on is wealth is in the form of assets, and those assets have value, but they're not being exchanged on a day-to-day basis to sustain uh, your living expenses per se, right? So income can be converted into wealth if, again, you have a pattern of savings, and that savings can transform to either purchase valuable assets or you save it. And that savings can be converted into other forms of wealth in terms of purchasing of stocks, bonds, and other valuable assets, right? And so I guess what I'm getting at is individuals that simply have high incomes do not necessarily make them wealthy, right? It simply means that they have the capacity to acquire wealth. It doesn't mean that they're wealthy unless they use that income to transfer it into an asset that they can use, that asset can grow, or they can invest to be able to accumulate more value for other assets. Hopefully that's clear, right? If it's not clear, there's a chat function. Please chat me a question, and I'll try to get to those questions and get back to you. So, in terms of wealth, think about it in the form of an asset, not simply something that you make, right? So, it bodes the question, if wealth is not synonymous with income, how do individuals in the United States, since we're living in the United States, and I know we're broadcasting globally, but since I'm in the United States, let's talk about it from a United States or a national perspective from America. How does individuals in the Americas accumulate wealth? What are the most common pathways to wealth, right? What are the most common pathways for individuals to acquire assets that retain a certain level of value that can be deemed to be wealth, right? If not income, what is that asset? Well, in most cases in the United States, wealth is held and stored in real estate, right? That's the most common pathway that individuals store their wealth and accumulate wealth. But a more important question is, I would ask, that I think that people have inquired about and researched over time, is what's the common way that individuals become wealthy. So if real estate is the way in which they store their wealth, how generally do they get in the position to actually acquire wealth? And then this is where my research comes into being. So I have an activity to see if we can get any engagement. So if there is anybody that's live streaming, I'm going to give you all a QR code and or a email address or a website, I'm sorry, in which you can enter the code to be able to provide any responses, and then we can kind of engage in that. So I'm going to show you the screen, and then I'll come back on here. All right. So if you have access to the QR code, you can go on and respond to the question itself. So let's answer the question. How do people generally become wealthy within the context of the United States, right? Many people think that the pathway to wealth for the United States is generally those who work hard, increase their income, and arrive at a position where they can begin to acquire assets or stocks or bonds, things that have value and which will accumulate or amass wealth. However, for the United States, that's not the trend. The most common pathway for wealth in the United States is intergenerational transfer of wealth, which means wealth passed from one generation to the next. That's the most common pathway that Americans that have acquired wealth in the past maintain wealth and get wealth from the start. So if the most common pathway toward wealthy households in the United States is through intergenerational wealth, what happens to households that do not have wealth, right? What are their pathways toward wealth? And generally speaking, for African Americans, it's as I stated before, it's through real estate. Now, when we talk about intergenerational transfer of wealth, we're talking about assets that are being passed, in most cases, from parents, grandparents, down to children or grandchildren, things such as that. But also, intergenerational transfer of wealth is other forms of transfer that are not in a monetary fashion or form. So let me give you an example. The most common pathway for wealth for American households that do have wealth is through, for example, the purchasing of home for children or down payments for homes for children, right? Another example of that transfer of wealth that's not monetary as it relates to money being passed from one generation to the next, but the paying of college tuition, which again, imagine graduating college with no debt, right? That is a value that's not monetized, but it's a value that places that individual in an advantage when hitting the job force, if you will, right? So, intergenerational transfer of wealth is a form of impacting one generation's wealth by a form of a gift, a form of some act that puts them in an advantage, or it can be simply a transfer of assets of value in which individuals acquire wealth um, through the passing from parents, grandparents, or lineage itself from the individual, in which they start at a place of wealth that they don't have to start from the bottom up, if you will, right? The reason why I want to mention this is I think part of the trend or narrative that has been distributed in the US is that individuals who are wealthy are those who work hard, buckle down, save well, spend smart, um, and acquire assets that eventually will make them wealthy. That's not to say that that's not a pathway that individuals do follow, but the most common form or pathway toward wealth is intergenerational transfer of wealth. So, where this crosses my research is for African Americans who typically do not have wealth to begin with, meaning that they don't have the ability to transfer wealth from one generation to the next. What's their common pathway toward wealth, right? And so, what I'm looking at is exploring factors or ways in which Africans store wealth, but how they gain access to those assets in which they can acquire or accumulate wealth over time, right? So when we look at African Americans, there's 5 central assets that they store wealth in. As I stated prior before, the most common asset in which African Americans store their wealth is in home ownership. And so what I argue and what I found in my research is that African American households primarily invest in what's called practical assets. And these practical assets are assets that, yes, have value, but also they're practical in the sense that they uh, take care of a need uh, and take care of a practical uh, necessity in order for them to sustain their day-to-day life. So when we talk about home ownership, we're talking about an asset that does accumulate value over time and increase, but also it's an asset that provides a basic human need, which is shelter, if you will, right? And so primarily for African Americans, over time, as well as historically, their home ownership has been the primary place in which they store majority of the wealth that they own. I would also argue that much of that wealth is in the form of equity, right? Which again, I said that we'll cover what equity is, but home ownership and equity within home ownership is the overwhelming majority of where African American households kind of store their wealth, right? Other assets that are common in which African Americans store their wealth is in the form of business assets, stocks, bonds, and then other assets too, such as uh, art, cars, jewelry, those things that maintain a certain level of value, but also, again, practical assets that's used on a day-to-day basis, right? So to the first question that I pose, how does African Americans store their wealth? The overwhelming majority of African Americans store their wealth primarily in the home ownership, right? I will also argue that for the larger American population, wealth is generally found in real estate and land ownership, home ownership, things such as that as well. So the reason why I'm focusing on this is if you think about African Americans in American history and you look at African Americans' limited access to home ownership in certain portions of African American history, how has that impacted African American households' wealth holdings over time? How has that impacted their ability to transfer wealth from one generation to the next, right? And then if it has impacted these individuals and these households, what's the remedy to make those things right? So this is kind of where the rubber meets the road in terms of a larger wealth discussion. If you think about wealth and the discussion of wealth, specifically for African Americans or Black Americans, you'll find a lot of conversation about the wealth gap between African Americans and their white counterparts, right? And so we look at those differences, we can see that there's a large gap between African Americans and their white counterparts, if you will. So I'm going to show you a graphic. I'm going to show you a couple of graphics, but I'll show you a graphic that looks at the racial wealth gap and the start in terms of looking at wealth. If you look at the studies of wealth, you'll find that wealth doesn't become popular in terms of looking at household economic realities until late 60s, but really around the 80s. But I'll show you the trends in terms of the wealth gap over time, and then I'll show you a trend that's happening early in the late in the 60s, but also it's a trend that's still happening now. So I'm going to show you a graphic. The audio is going to go out, but I'll show you a graphic and then I'll come back online. Okay. So what are we looking at? What we're looking at is the wealth gap between African American households and their white counterparts. The thing that is important about this particular graph is it looks at the year 1967, 1984, and 1988. Now, some of you all might say, well, this is close to 40 years ago. What's the importance of this data? So let me start by looking at 1967. What's the importance of 1967, right? If you look at the Civil Rights Bill that was passed 1964, 1965, shortly thereafter, you find the Fair Housing Act passed 1968, right? So what you'll find is at the end of 1960s, you'll find landmark legislation that's passed to be able to leverage the playing field. Now, with this legislation, of course, it provides equal access to employment, equal access to education, and equal access to home ownership, if you will, right? And so if we look back at this graphic, the reason why 1967 is important is because this is the period of time after this landmark legislation is passed. So the common thought is that after civil rights legislation was passed, it levels the playing field as it relates to access to resources or access to services that allow you to improve your living conditions. So, for example, if you have access to education, you can improve your state in the sense that you can have better access to jobs. Better access to jobs translate to better, more access to accumulate wealth, um, more access to better paying jobs, which allow you to save more, purchase more assets, invest, so on and so forth. So it's a trickle effect. So 1967 is important because one, it's around the time where this legislation passed. Now, one of the things that you also find is that the gap in wealth holdings gets larger and larger after that point. So I'm going to show the graphic again, and then I'll come back. But one of the things that I want you to pay attention to is look at the wealth gap and its growth in the 3 periods of time that they actually focus on. And then I also want you to keep in mind that this wealth gap is growing after legislation is passed that's supposed to level the playing field. So I'm going to show the graphic one more time. So when we have conversations about African Americans' experience here in the United States, when we have conversations about racial wealth relation, racial race relations, I'm sorry, when we have conversations about African Americans having access to different services, whether that's education, the ability to purchase homes, fair employment, and things such as that, that's part of where the rubber meets the road in terms of my research, and also how it links to the wealth gap and how it links to or impacts African Americans' ability to accumulate wealth over time. So going back to that graphic, the thing that's important for us to look at is that the wealth gap, one, is growing, right? So if you look at the wealth gap in 67, it's smaller, and it grows larger when you get to 84, and then it grows even larger when it gets to 88. The trend that you'll find is that this wealth gap is growing after legislation is passed that's supposed to eradicate any barriers that actually impact people's ability to gain access to resources and to improve their livelihood. The unfortunate thing about this is that when we look at the wealth gap today, it's still growing wider and wider, if you will. So I'm going to show you another graphic, and this is just a snapshot. And I want you to take a look at the different racial groups, but I also want you to be able to identify where blacks are as it relates to their wealth holding in comparison to other individuals. Okay. So after looking at that particular graphic, what you'll find is African American households have the smallest wealth holdings of the different racial groups that's looked at. Of course, there's only 3 racial groups on this particular chart, which is African Americans that are labeled as black, European Americans which is labeled as white, and Latinx Americans, which is labeled as Hispanic, right? And so the thing that I want you to pull away from this is, one, African Americans have the lowest wealth holdings of the groups that's shown, right? And the important thing, or the question that hopefully you're thinking, is what contributes to African Americans being at the bottom as it relates to wealth holdings amongst the different groups. So when we look at racial wealth gap and the factors that contribute to these things, there are two factors that are important. There's merit-based factors that influence to this gap. And by merit-based, it means things that legitimately explain why there's a difference from one group growing in a particular gap, right? Those are the merit-based explanations. And then there's non-merit-based explanations that make sense of why this wealth gap is growing larger and larger. So let's look at the merit-based, things that we can tangibly look at and explain why these gaps are growing over time, right? And so the merit-based explanation for this wealth gap are things that we already know. So income, education, family structure, investment, spending habits, all of these things contribute to an individual's ability to grow their wealth, or a household's ability to grow their wealth. These are things that people engage in that help to explain why this gap is getting larger and larger. So, for example, if African American households' income are much lower, then again, it impacts their ability to acquire assets that hold wealth, if you will, right? If African Americans as individuals have a lower level of education that they've attained over time, then it impacts their ability to acquire in our society the more higher paying job, which again impacts your income, right? If you look at the family structure, if you have a two income household, in most cases, the statistics show that two income households generally make more than a single income household. So if your family structure impacts the ability or impacts the income of the household itself, again, that can impact your ability to, again, acquire assets that can be deemed to be to transform or deemed to be wealth, if you will, right? Spending habits. So remember, if I made $100 and I spend 99, well, that's part of your spending habits. All of these things impact your ability to acquire wealth or wealth accumulating assets, if you will. So that's the merit base, right? Let's look at the non-merit base factors that influence this gap. And so there's only three that I've identified that's most consistent with research. The first on this is inheritance, right? And inheritance is going back to that term that I used before when I say intergenerational transfer of wealth. And inheritance is a passing down of resources, assets, or wealth from one generation to another, if you will, right? So an inheritance is something that you inherit. In most cases, it's due to the death of an individual in which assets are transferred or bequeathed to another individual. So inheritance is a non-merit based explanation, which it's something that you can't account for, right? Another non-merit based factor is institutional racism. So we'll talk about institutional racism, or institutional discrimination is another form that we can use to kind of contextualize it. Essentially, what institutional racism or discrimination seeks, or how it plays a role in terms of influencing racial wealth gap, is preventing individuals from having access to certain resources, but also when individuals have access to resources, factors that impact the value that's associated with those resources. So I'm going to come to that and we'll talk about that, right? And then the third and final in terms of the non-merit based factors is discriminatory public policy, which again is policy that advantage certain groups but creates a disadvantage for other groups. All right. So which of these factors play more of a role in terms of determining this wealth gap? I know I stated it before, but that's a question that you should have at the forefront of your mind. Of all the things that I named, what's the most important factor, or what are the cluster of factors that influence this gap and the trend of this gap growing over time? So in many cases, what you'll find is there's a lot of discourse and discussion around African Americans and the merit-based factors that influence this wealth gap. So what you'll find is a lot of commentary around African Americans not investing in education, African Americans not investing in home ownership or renting versus purchasing a property, right? African Americans and their spending habits, right? African Americans and their lack or low investment in wealth accumulating assets, right? And then African Americans and their family structures in terms of having a large percentage of single parent households. All of these are the factors that kind of circle around the conversation around African Americans and their ability to accumulate wealth. So I'll state this. All of those are factors, right? So I'm not arguing that these factors do not influence African American households. What I will argue is that these factors are not as significant as the non-merit-based factors that I discussed before, right? The leading factor that influences the wealth gap between African American households and their white counterparts is intergenerational transfer of wealth. That factor accumulates for 2/3 of the gap that we see between African American households and their white counterparts. So think about that. That's 66% of the gap that exists as it relates to wealth. That statistic is shown and proven through research that much of this gap is explained through not just inheritance, but those other factors as well that I talked about before. The ability of gifting, for example, gifting offspring, children, grandchildren, paying down payments, purchasing homes, putting a significant amount on assets such as home ownership, right? Paying for college and tuition. All of these are non-merit based factors that help to drive that gap that we just seen in the two graphics that I've shown, right? And so let's look at the non-merit based factors that I talked about. For African Americans, as we know, race and race relations for African Americans have not always been as positive. Over time, of course, we've worked to transform those things. And as I stated at the beginning of my discussion, my focus has been on social movements. And so if you look at social movements, those are the apparatuses that we've used to kind of counter and push back against systems that seek to create disadvantages for people of African descent and other people of color as well. So when we look at public policy that is discriminatory in nature, what does that look like, right? These factors have impacted African Americans over time across generations, right? And impacting generations and their ability to accumulate wealth over time helps to produce as well as widen this wealth gap that we just discussed. So I'm gonna use it and I'm gonna put it into an analogy, and hopefully this makes sense. If it doesn't drive home, of course, you can hit me in the chat, and then I can maybe create another example. So think about it like this. Say we all are responsible for crossing the desert by foot, right? So that's the example, crossing the desert by foot, meaning that we're walking across the desert from one end of the desert to the next. If you think about this and put it in the context of wealth, you can say, hey, an individual's will to get across that desert is very important. An individual's forward movement, healthy thought process about crossing the desert, i.e., for example, if you become overwhelmed because you have to walk across it, that can impact you actually getting to the other side. So if you think about those things, your will, your strategy, your mind state, all of those things can be merit based, right? Because if you don't walk, you won't get across the desert, right? If you have no will, at some point in time, you can stop and it doesn't get you across the desert. So if we think about merit based factors, those are very important as it relates to getting across the desert. But let's think about other factors that you have to take into consideration. So if you think about it in the sense that if there's pathways created for some deserts or for some individuals that's crossing that desert, but not others, it creates a difficult path, right? If you think about the weather conditions, if you're crossing the desert in the mid height of the summer, then it creates a different circumstance in terms of crossing the desert. If you have access to waterways and access to other resources that allows you to replenish yourself as you walk across that impact. So those are things that you cannot influence. You can control your will, you can control the system or the strategy that you use, but you can't control the weather patterns. You can't control the pathways that exist within and so those would be the non-merit based factors. So when we talk about discriminatory practices, what we're talking about is, for example, creating pathways for some people to walk across the desert but not others, if you will, right? Allowing some people to walk in more cooler climates while forcing others at hotter climates to walk across the desert, right? And so in this example, what you'll see is the creation of different gaps in terms of people's ability to get across this barrier while creating disadvantages for others that's crossing that same desert, if you will, right? And so let's look at African Americans over time, and we'll look at the matrix that individuals have used over time in terms of accumulating factors. But let me go back to the non-merit base. So what's institutional discrimination? So for example, for African Americans, we all are familiar with the institution of slavery, which is an institution that prohibited African Americans from having access to the large percentage of African Americans from having access to education, for example, right? As we know, education is one of the pathways to acquire wealth, gain access to jobs, so on and so forth, right? This particular institution prohibited African Americans from home ownership, a large percentage of African Americans from home ownership, again, impacting their ability to accumulate wealth over time, right? After the enslavement of African Americans, or a large percentage of African Americans, we have the Jim Crow era with racial codes that, again, prevents African Americans from having access to certain employment, have access to the political infrastructure here, the criminal justice system here. All of these things impact African Americans from taking advantage of our citizens' right in terms of being here. So again, impacting your ability to accumulate wealth or align yourself with resources that allows you to accumulate wealth over time. All right. So after Jim Crow, you have the segregation period, right? Again, providing racial segregation in housing, racial segregation in schools, racial segregation in all different parts of society. Again, if we see that as a barrier in terms of preventing individuals' ability to align themselves and accumulate wealth over time or gain the uh, the skill set, the ability, the access to, again, it creates a ripple over time and time and time. So when I say discriminatory practices, I'm not talking only about today. I'm talking about an impacted or compounded impact over time, if you will. And so again, if intergenerational transfer of wealth over time is the most common pathway to wealth, then again, we have to look at African American households over an extended period of time to be able to get a better picture of what wealth looks like, but also explain the wealth gap that we're seeing here, right? And so we're talking about a large scale, long term, longitudinal kind of viewpoint as it relates to explaining the wealth gap. So let's look at strategies that African Americans have utilized to kind of overcome these barriers and still continue the track across the desert, but try to break down some of the barriers uh, as other groups have done over the past. So, in terms of a wealth matrix, there are 7 key components that I've identified that are socioeconomic factors that go into acquiring wealth. So I'll show you this metrics and then I'll pause for a second. Okay, so when you look at the graphic that I showed, these 7 factors that influence, and this is what you can control, right? So, what you can control in terms of factors that contribute to your ability to accumulate wealth, of course, of those factors, the leading factor is income, right? Income. Other factors that contribute to that are education, your work history, your age, what region or location you live at, meaning your access to good paying jobs versus living wage jobs, right? Your family structure, your occupational field. All of these factors are the leading factors that kind of contribute and influence your ability to accumulate wealth. So for African American households, what you'll find is that these are the 7 factors that African American households and individuals can control as it relates to, if you go back to the example that I used, their trek across the desert, right? And so these are the merit-based factors that African Americans can control and have controlled, and we'll talk about how. I'm going to do a time check. We're at 8:08, and I'll get a check to see if I get to a point, we'll take a pause, or if I should just continue to move. So, Minister Fred, should we continue, or should I move to a place to where I could take a pause and pick up next week?
Go ahead, about 10 or 15 more minutes.
Okay. Okay. So, when we look at African Americans, what we'll find is, of course, over time, our income has increased, but it hasn't increased at the same rate as other racial groups in the country, right? And so, what you'll find is African Americans' participation in education or higher education has increased over time, right? Which is a good thing, right? African Americans' income have increased over time. African Americans' occupational fields have diversified. So, as I sit here today, of course, I work on a college campus, right? Which, uh, has not always been a place in which African Americans can secure positions such as these. We have doctors, lawyers, right? Elected politicians. We have a wide range of different people, business owners, Fortune 500 CEOs, right? We have a very diverse body of individuals getting into a number of different occupational fields. And so for African Americans, over time, we have uh, had success in terms of breaking uh, ceilings and getting into new spaces, which have increased our ability to accumulate wealth over time. In terms of the regions that we exist in, of course, for African Americans, at one point in time, we primarily concentrated in a very specific space, and that was in the southern part of the United States. Of course, uh, during the Jim Crow era, we have the Great Migration of African Americans going north, going west, and different parts throughout the country. So we'll find, in terms of the socioeconomic wealth matrix, African Americans have begun to engage and break out of spaces that before barriers had prevented African Americans from kind of moving out of. So for African Americans, when you look at our diversification in terms of employment, uh, we've made very large strides. We've made uh, very large gains as it relates to where we've moved and even our home ownership. However, we'll find that there's trends that again we'll see those barriers coming to the forefront. So in the beginning, when I started to talk, I stated that African Americans primarily hold their wealth in home ownership, right? If you look at the turn of the 20th century, right, African Americans owned home at the rate about 50%. So 50% of African American households owned homes, if you will, and this is a national statistic. However, if you look today, there's a decline in that home ownership, right? We'll find that African Americans primarily we own homes around 43%, and that's give or take depending on what location that you're looking at. But the national average is around 43%. So, what I would like to move into is what are the factors that are impacting the current trends that we're starting to see in terms of African Americans, their wealth holdings, as well as where they're starting to hold and store their wealth currently. So when we look at our wealth and our wealth holdings, African Americans, uh, the overwhelming majority of African Americans, again, they store their wealth in their home ownership, but primarily in those practical assets that I stated before. Unfortunately for African Americans, uh, the overwhelming majority of African Americans, and that's about 60% of African Americans, do not have wealth, right? They do not hold wealth in the form of net financial assets. For African Americans, the core of our wealth is stored in the equity in the homes that we purchase, right? So it's not liquid assets in the form that you can liquidate them and turn them into cash in a very quick way. Of course, you can pull equity out the home, right? However, uh, majority of the wealth that we hold is controlled in home equity, and that's around 41% of African American household wealth. So the overwhelming majority of our wealth is held in equity. And so let me define what equity is. I know I mentioned it before and I just mentioned it again. So equity, again, is the value of a given asset minus the debt or what you own on that particular asset. So to make it simple, if I own a vehicle, for example, and that vehicle is worth $10, uh, and I owe $5, that means that the equity in that particular asset is $5. So it's the value of that particular asset versus what you owe, meaning what you're still paying on that asset. So when we talk about home ownership, of course, home ownership is probably one of the largest purchases that Americans uh, engage in. And so when we talk about home ownership, again, in most cases, people acquire homes through lending agencies in which they are actually borrowing to be able to purchase that asset. And so while you own or you're in possession of that asset, you still have a mortgage, which means that you still have some to pay off. So when I say equity, it's the value of that asset versus what you actually owe on that asset. And so going back to African American households, the primarily what we store our wealth in is that equity, meaning the value of the asset that we purchase. In this sense, the home, which is the value versus what we currently owe on it, minus what we currently owe on it. All right. So what's the benefits of this? And what's the disadvantages for storing our wealth in this manner? All right. So the benefit of this is, of course, with home ownership, um, it's a practical asset that um, you can utilize while you're still paying it off. It takes care of a need um, in terms of providing shelter. And also, it provides you the ability to be able to extract some of that equity. So, for example, that $5 example that I gave you is worth 10, you owe 5, the equity is 5 because that's what's left, right? You can borrow against that equity, right? And you can turn it into another investment source, if you will, right? The disadvantages for it is the value of homes can fluctuate. It can increase, but it also can decrease, right? And in most cases, home ownership and the values that's set to home, the trends uh, are pretty steady over time, but it can fluctuate up and down quickly. Uh, so, for example, if you use the housing crisis of 2008, where you find housing values plummeting over time, storing your assets and storing your wealth in that form, you can lose value in a very fast pace, for example. However, what you'll find is these trends don't come around quite often. Um, in most recent history, there's been only two Great Depressions, if you will. The Great Depression of the 1930s, and then, of course, the housing crisis of the 2008. So when we look at wealth for African Americans, it's been a safe bet, but also it's been the asset that makes the most sense. I can purchase it, I can touch it, I can see it, and also it provides me um, an immediate benefit, meaning it provides housing for me. Um, Other forms of assets, such as stocks, bonds, and other business assets, for example, those are things that for African Americans, there's an increase in terms of us getting in those areas. But again, that practical asset, it's not an asset that you can see, you can touch. In some cases, understanding the fluctuation of different markets, the increase of certain stocks and bonds versus the decrease, the volatility of the market, all of these things can influence. And so, in many cases, African Americans' participation in that market hasn't, you know, provided a large percentage of where African Americans hold their assets. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause here. What I want to do when we move forward and looking at the next conversation is having a conversation about what are the strategies for African Americans in terms of understanding the barriers that stands before them, and what strategies have we used to overcome those barriers, and what has yielded the most success as it relates to African American household accumulating wealth over time. All right. So when we look at the racial wealth gap, I'm going to end here. When we look at the racial wealth gap, that gap is influenced by African Americans' behavior in terms of what we invest our time, our energy, and our resources in. But the larger percentage of this wealth gap are factors that are not controlled by us. Much of it is controlled by the racial climate that we have in our country. And I'll talk about this next time as well. So when we talk about home ownership, for example, African American communities over time have not yielded the same level of value as non-African American communities. So how does that impact African Americans' ability to accumulate wealth again and grow their wealth? So if I'm purchasing home, which is the common pathway toward wealth in the United States, but the asset that I purchase is of less value, how does that impact my ability again to transfer wealth and utilize that asset to be able to grow my wealth down the line, right? To pull more equity out. This is important because we see these trends happening in the very communities that we live in. So, for example, you see different communities that changed over time, meaning at one point in time in history, communities are predominantly white. And then you'll find a transition where they become predominantly black. The same community, same homes, no new homes built, but you see the value fluctuating as the demographic of those communities changing. Those are factors that become very important because when African Americans own those same assets, if they have a depreciated value, what does that mean in the larger scale and the scheme of things as it relates to African American accumulating wealth collectively and then using that wealth to pass down from one generation to the next? So I'm going to pause here. When we come back next week, I'll talk about strategies for African Americans, how they use to overcome those barriers, but also discuss how the conversation around race can be incorporated in terms of the behavior and the engagement that African Americans have done in the areas of wealth to be able to overturn the conditions that they exist in and reverse the wealth gap from getting wider to shortening up. All right, so I'll pause there. I'll stop there. If there's any questions, I'll take any questions. But for now, I'll pause there. And then until next time, I'll pick up and we'll talk about strategies and successes, different forms of success that African Americans have had in terms of removing those barriers and still growing their wealth. All right. So I'll pause there. Thank you again for your time. Again, I hope that this has been fruitful. Hopefully that this information can be used. And then next week, we'll talk about the more positive aspects and trends for African Americans in terms of wealth creation.
And we thank you for joining in. This went a little longer. We had a few technical problems at the beginning, so we went a little longer than we usually go, but we know and believe you have something from there. I picked up the scripture because he taught from a strictly teaching and documentation perspective, but what the Lord says is, I give you the ability to acquire wealth. That's what he wants us to have. However, one of the things that I've come so vividly to know is that there takes a mindset of a change. You have to change your mindset. That no matter, one of the things we have here in our Kingdom Life Institute is more aged people. Then if you can change your mindset that I need to figure out what I can transfer to the next generation to help somebody else. I'm going to let you go and not get into all of the thoughts I have in my head of what Dr. Gamage went over. But next week also, our pastor will be communicating and back and forth with Dr. Gamage to bring in how this fits into kingdom life and how it fits into what we want you to gain from and obtain from this particular session here on acquiring wealth here in the United States. What our pastor continually says, I'm on my way to rich, but I'm not going to stop until I become wealthy. And so you have to know what the barriers are, but not allow the barriers to stop you, but learn how to overcome the barriers that are placed there before you. Once again, we thank you for this time. We thank you for staying a little longer with us. And each week, as you know, those of you that continuously tune in, our pastor asks for you to assist us with an offering, and our different ways to give are up on the screen at this time. If you'll be a part of assisting us financially, we would appreciate it. Main thing next week, bring your notebooks. Take some notes. Have a mindset of how can I increase? How can I do better? If you have $10 billion, how can I do better? Warren Buffett doesn't stop at, I'm considered the richest man. He's trying to get more. If you've got $20 million, how can you do better? Work that gift. Work that gift that God has given you. So until this time next week, may God bless you and may God keep you.